I'll make this quick, old man. Then I'll show you why you should never mess with a seal again. The silence lingered in the air, thick and heavy. John Miller stood motionless, the words still echoing in his ears. The weight of the old man's presence seemed to settle over the entire camp, as if time itself had slowed. He had heard of legends, of warriors who had disappeared into the shadows of history, but he never expected one to stand right in front of him, so unassuming, so calm. As the officer's words continued to sink in, the reality of the situation started to dawn on him. James Thompson, the quiet old man with the worn-out jacket, was not someone to be underestimated. John had no idea who he was dealing with. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why had he reacted this way? Why had he challenged the man who was now standing in front of him, unshaken and full of quiet dignity? His confusion only deepened. Just then, the officer's voice broke the stillness again, his words slicing through the tension like a blade. "Sergeant Major Thompson," the officer said, his tone filled with reverence. He was one of the first to fight in the hardest battles this country has ever seen. His name is known by every man who ever wore this uniform. John's gaze flicked from the officer to James, but James didn't seem interested in the praise. His eyes remained steady, distant even, as if he had heard such words many times before. James looked down at the ground, his mind wandering back to the days when he had fought in jungles and deserts, when every step he took could have been his last. His fingers, still gnarled with age, tightened around his cane, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. The room was already filled with a quiet understanding that couldn't be undone. The officer, now realizing the gravity of the moment, stood at attention. "I apologize for the disrespect," he said, his voice steady but filled with a deep respect. "Sergeant Major Thompson, you have earned the right to stand here today, and I am honored to be in your presence." John felt a knot form in his stomach. He had been the one mocking, the one disrespecting. But now, as the officer saluted James, John felt small. His bravado, the cocky attitude that had defined him, seemed insignificant in the presence of a man who had seen the horrors of war and lived to tell the tale. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the wind outside and the soft footsteps of the officer as he stepped back. James, still standing in the center of the room, didn't acknowledge the apology. He didn't need to. His life had already proven everything that needed to be said. John stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. The realization hit him harder than anything he had experienced in his military career. His entire world, his understanding of strength, honor, and respect, had been turned upside down by the quiet, unassuming presence of an old man who had lived through it all. And as the officer turned to leave, John felt his legs give way. He dropped to his knees, his body trembling with the weight of his own realization. He had been wrong. So wrong. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the truth. James Thompson had lived the life he only dreamed of, fighting for something greater than himself, surviving against all odds, and earning the respect of every man who had the honor of standing in his presence. The air felt heavier now, thicker with something John couldn't quite place. He was still kneeling, hands trembling on the dirt beneath him, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had just happened. James Thompson stood a few feet away, unmoved, a silent figure that seemed to fill the room with his presence. The wind outside picked up, rattling the windows, but inside, everything was still. John's heart beat louder in his chest than it ever had in combat, and for the first time in years, he felt truly out of his depth. He had always prided himself on his skills, on the things he could do, quick decisions, sharp reflexes, the confidence of a SEAL. But none of that mattered now. None of it could measure up to the quiet dignity James Thompson exuded. Slowly, John lifted his gaze, meeting the eyes of the old man for the first time since the exchange had started. James didn't say anything, but there was a softness in his expression now, as though he had finally allowed himself to see the young man for what he was, a soldier who had never been taught the true meaning of respect. The room was silent, but it felt as if a million thoughts were swirling through John's mind. "I don't know how to say this," John started, his voice barely above a whisper. James simply nodded, as though he understood. I thought you were just some old man, you know." John continued, the words spilling out now. "I thought you were past it, that maybe you were just a relic of some past era. But now, Now I see I was wrong. He swallowed hard, trying to push down the lump in his throat. James didn't speak, but his gaze softened, understanding the weight of the apology even before it was fully out. For the first time, John realized how much he had taken his training, his reputation, his identity for granted. He had spent so long relying on his outward strength, his position, his medals, and his youthful energy. But here, in the face of a man who had truly lived through hardship and sacrifice, he felt small. "You've earned more than I ever will," John said, his voice steadying. "You didn't need to prove anything to anyone." James stood there for a moment longer, and John wasn't sure if he was waiting for something. But then, without a word, James extended his hand. John looked at it for a moment before taking it, feeling the firmness of the handshake, the years of wisdom and experience in the old man's grip. "It's not about proving anything," James said, his voice low but clear. "It's about knowing when to stand and when to step back. It's about understanding that real strength doesn't come from how loud you can shout, but how quiet you can be when it matters most." John nodded, feeling the full weight of his words. He had spent years trying to outpace time, trying to prove himself to others, but now he understood. True respect was earned quietly, in the moments when no one was watching. The officer who had initially spoken up earlier now approached them. He, too, seemed to recognize the shift in the room, the change that had come over John. "Sergeant Major Thompson," the officer began, his voice respectful. "I think it's time we got you settled in. There's someone you should meet." James nodded, and for the first time in a long while, John felt like he was walking beside someone who truly understood what it meant to be a hero. No need for medals, no need for recognition, just the quiet, unwavering strength of someone who had been there, done that, and come out the other side. As they walked together, John could feel a new understanding rising in him. He didn't need to shout his accomplishments or boast of his abilities. He simply needed to keep walking, to keep learning, and to keep earning the respect that came not from others, but from within himself. As they walked together, the sound of their footsteps echoed through the quiet camp. But for John, the world felt different now. The tension that had gripped him only hours ago had loosened, replaced with a strange, unfamiliar calm. The reality of everything that had just happened settled in like a heavy weight, and he found himself reflecting on his own life, his own choices, in a way he hadn't done before. James Thompson, this quiet, unassuming man, had taught him more in a few minutes than he had learned in years of training. It wasn't about the things John could do, the medals he had earned, or the titles he held. It was about something deeper, something he hadn't understood until now. They reached a small clearing where a few soldiers were gathered. James didn't pause, didn't hesitate, as he walked past them. They straightened up as he approached, their eyes filled with something John couldn't quite place: respect, awe, recognition. James's presence commanded it, and for the first time, John felt the true meaning of what it was to be a leader. He had always thought that power came from authority, from command, from the ability to control others. But now, walking beside James, he realized that true power came from something else: humility, experience, and a quiet strength that needed no loud declarations. "Sergeant Major Thompson," one of the soldiers said, stepping forward. "It's an honor, sir." James nodded, acknowledging the greeting with a slight movement of his head. John watched, surprised at how effortlessly James commanded this respect. It was as though he didn't need to say anything. His very presence spoke volumes. They were led into a modest tent where a few officers were waiting. As they entered, one of the officers, a tall man with a stern face, stood and saluted James. "Sergeant Major Thompson," he said, his voice filled with reverence. "We've been expecting you." James returned the salute, his movements slow, deliberate. "I'm just here to do what's right," he said simply, his voice calm and steady. John stood off to the side, still trying to process everything. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but it wasn't this. The officers continued to speak, but John barely registered the words. His mind was too preoccupied with the way James had carried himself, with the way the world seemed to change when people recognized his name. It wasn't about the uniforms, the titles, or the rank. It was about the respect that had been earned over years of service, of sacrifice, and of quiet heroism. "You know, Thompson," one of the officers said, breaking John's reverie, You've earned more than most of us could ever hope for." James shook his head slightly, almost imperceptibly. "I didn't do it for the recognition," he replied. "I did it because it needed to be done." The simplicity of the words, the humility in his tone, made John feel even smaller. For years, he had chased after recognition, after approval, after the validation that came with being the best. But here, in this moment, he realized that none of that mattered. It was the quiet ones, the ones who didn't seek the spotlight, who truly earned the most respect. James continued to speak with the officers, but John's mind was still spinning, his thoughts on the lesson he had just learned. He had been so caught up in his own image, his own ego, that he had failed to see the value in the things that truly mattered. As they prepared to leave, John found himself walking a few steps behind James, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He had a lot to learn, and for the first time, he realized that he didn't have all the answers. But that was okay. Maybe it was time to stop pretending like he did. The next few days passed in a blur for John Miller. He was still trying to process everything that had happened, the events that had unfolded with Sergeant Major James Thompson. The weight of his actions and the things he had said to the old man hung over him like a dark cloud. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood about respect, about sacrifice, and about what it really meant to be a soldier. It wasn't about the flashy gear, the sharp uniforms, or the gold bars on your collar. It was about the quiet moments, the battles fought not for recognition, but for something greater. James had embodied that in a way John had never seen before. His presence alone was enough to silence a room, to command respect without ever raising his voice. The respect that James had earned wasn't the kind that came from medals or titles. It was the kind that was earned through years of service, through standing firm in the face of adversity, and through never asking for anything in return. John found himself thinking about that every time he looked at James. The old man had been a part of something much bigger than himself. He had been through battles that John couldn't even begin to comprehend, yet he remained humble, calm, and unwavering. There was no arrogance in him, no need to prove himself. He had already done that long ago, and he carried it with him in a way that felt effortless. John had spent years trying to prove himself, trying to be the best, trying to be the one everyone looked up to. But now, standing in the shadow of a man who had lived through things he couldn't even imagine, John felt small. The next morning, after another quiet encounter with James, John found himself sitting outside, looking out at the horizon. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that reminded him of how much he had taken for granted. He had spent so much of his life focused on the next mission, the next promotion, the next achievement, that he had forgotten to appreciate the simple things. The way the world looked when you stopped to really see it. The way the wind felt on your face when you took a moment to breathe. He realized now that he had been chasing the wrong things. It wasn't about the next goal, the next title, or the next victory. It was about the moments in between, the quiet moments, the times when you could look back and realize that you had made a difference, not by how loud you shouted, but by how steady you stood. James had shown him that. As the sun rose higher in the sky, John made a promise to himself. He would no longer chase recognition. He would no longer seek the approval of others. He would learn to stand steady, to be the kind of man who earned respect not through force, but through quiet strength. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was headed in the right direction. The old man had taught him something he couldn't unlearn, something that would change him forever. He stood up, feeling the weight of his decision settle into his bones. James had been right all along. The real measure of a man wasn't in his rank, his medals, or his call sign. It was in the way he carried himself, in the way he faced the world without needing to prove anything to anyone. The days that followed were different. John Miller's routine had shifted, not because of orders or missions, but because something had changed inside him. He had been taught countless lessons during his time in the military, about strength, about leadership, about survival, but none of those lessons had ever felt as important as the one he had learned from James Thompson. Every time John caught himself thinking about the things he had done, the people he had impressed, he remembered the quiet strength of the old man. James had never needed to announce his worth to anyone. He simply was, and that, in itself, was more powerful than anything John had ever achieved. John found himself reflecting on his actions more than he ever had before. He had always believed that success was measured by how fast you ran, how high you climbed, and how loudly you shouted. But now, he understood that real success was measured by the calmness in your heart when the world is in chaos. He wasn't sure when the shift had happened, but now, he spent more time observing, listening, and taking things in, instead of rushing to be the first to act or speak. One morning, he walked into the camp's mess hall to find James already there, seated at a table by the window. The sunlight filtered through the trees outside, casting a warm glow over the room. James didn't look up when John entered, but he could feel the quiet presence of the old man. John hesitated for a moment, then walked over and sat down across from him. "You know," John said after a moment, "I've been thinking a lot about what you said the other day, about how real strength doesn't need to be loud." James nodded but didn't respond immediately. He simply sipped his coffee, his gaze focused on the horizon outside. It wasn't the first time John had noticed that James seemed to see things beyond what was immediately in front of him. "I've spent most of my life thinking that if I wasn't pushing forward, I wasn't doing enough," John continued. "But I'm starting to see now that maybe it's about knowing when to slow down." James finally looked up, meeting John's eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, only a quiet understanding. "Life moves fast, John," James said slowly. "And sometimes, it's easy to get caught up in the race. But the real test of a man is when he knows how to stand still, how to let the noise settle, and just be." John nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. The burden of constantly needing to prove himself, of constantly striving for more, seemed less heavy now. He realized that he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. It was enough just to be present, to do what was right, and to stand firm in his beliefs. The rest, the accolades and the recognition, would come or not, but it didn't matter. He wasn't living for those things anymore. As they sat there in the quiet of the mess hall, John felt a peace he hadn't known before. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. He didn't need to rush to the next mission, the next achievement. He could take his time, listen, and learn from the world around him. And with James Thompson sitting across from him, offering nothing but quiet wisdom, John knew that he had everything he needed to move forward, not with loud steps, but with steady, confident ones. Weeks passed, and John Miller's transformation wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. The fast-paced, always-on mentality that had once defined him began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding of his place in the world. It was subtle, like the change from night to day, gradual but undeniable. As time went on, he found himself more attuned to the people around him, less focused on impressing others and more on learning from them. He was still the same soldier, still capable and driven, but now there was a new sense of purpose behind his actions. One morning, as the sun rose over the camp, casting long shadows on the ground, John found himself once again sitting across from James Thompson. The old man was as composed as ever, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, the steam rising from it in soft curls. John had learned to appreciate these moments of quiet, these moments of stillness that came with simply being present. They didn't need to talk. The silence between them was comfortable, like two old friends who didn't need words to understand each other. But this morning, something was different. James looked at John, his gaze steady, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes, almost like a question. "How are you holding up, John?" James asked, his voice as calm as always. It was a simple question, but for John, it felt like a turning point. He paused for a moment, unsure of how to answer. He had spent so long masking his feelings, pushing them down beneath the surface, but now, with James looking at him so kindly, he felt like he could be honest. I'm getting there," John said slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about slowing down. I never realized how much I was missing by always rushing ahead." James nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "It's easy to get caught up in the race, but you don't have to run your entire life. Sometimes the best way forward is to take a step back and let things come to you." John thought about that for a moment. He had always been in such a hurry, always pushing himself to be the best, to outdo everyone else. He had measured his worth by what he could accomplish, by how fast he could go. But now, he saw the truth in James's words. Maybe it wasn't about always going forward. Maybe it was about being patient, about letting things unfold naturally. As if sensing John's thoughts, James continued, "You can still be driven, still be focused, but don't lose sight of what's important. Don't forget to appreciate the journey along the way. It's not always about the destination." John smiled slightly, a sense of peace settling over him. He had never heard anyone speak like that before, certainly not anyone in his world of military precision and constant motion. James's words felt like a lifeline, something he could hold on to when the weight of the world started to press down on him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. He didn't need to be the fastest or the strongest. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needed to be present, to listen, and to learn. And in that moment, as he sat there with James Thompson, he knew that was enough. "Thanks, James," John said, his voice sincere. "I don't know if I would have understood this without you." James smiled, his eyes warm with understanding. "We all need someone to help us see things clearly, John. You just happened to find me at the right time." They sat there together, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting its light on the camp and the quiet soldiers within it. John no longer felt the need to rush. He knew that the road ahead, wherever it led, would unfold in its own time, and he was ready to walk it, one step at a time. John sat outside, the warm afternoon sun casting long shadows over the camp. It had been weeks since the conversation with James, and the changes in him were becoming more evident. It wasn't just his thoughts that had shifted, his actions had begun to reflect the new understanding he had of himself and the world around him. He spent more time in quiet contemplation, less time rushing into situations without thought. The calmness that James had shown him had become his own, a strength he never knew he had. The hum of the camp faded into the background as John lost himself in his thoughts. He had always been a man of action, driven by the adrenaline of success, but now he realized that there was power in stillness, in listening, and in being present. The old man had taught him to see the world through a different lens, to stop chasing and start living. As he sat there, his mind wandered to the next mission, the next challenge. He had once viewed those moments as opportunities to prove himself, to show others what he was capable of. Now, though, the thought of that same challenge didn't feel the same. He wasn't eager to rush into it. Instead, he felt a quiet readiness. If it came, and he would face it with the same calm confidence that James had. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He looked up to see James walking toward him, the same quiet confidence in his stride. James sat down next to him, not saying a word at first. They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them just enjoying the stillness. Then James spoke, his voice steady and sure. "You've changed, John," he said. "I can see it in your eyes. It's the kind of change that doesn't need to be announced. It's the kind that's felt." John nodded slowly, not sure how to respond. There was no need for words. He understood exactly what James meant. "I've been thinking a lot," John said finally, his voice quiet. "About everything. About the way I've been living, the way I've been seeing the world. It's different now, and it feels right." James smiled, a small, knowing smile. "The world doesn't change overnight, John. But when it does, you'll know. You'll feel it in your bones, like you've always known it. You just had to catch up to it." John sat back, letting the weight of those words settle in his mind. He didn't need to chase after validation anymore. The quiet strength he had learned from James was enough. The feeling was something deep, something that ran through his veins like a steady river. It was confidence, but not the kind that came from loud proclamations. It was the kind that came from within, from knowing who you were and standing firm in it. As they sat there, watching the sun begin to dip below the horizon, John realized that he no longer feared the future. He didn't need to know what it held. Whatever came next, he would face it with the same calm that James had shown him. And for the first time in his life, he was at peace with that. The next morning, John woke up early, the camp still shrouded in quiet darkness. The faint hum of the bass was barely noticeable as the first light of dawn crept across the sky. He sat up slowly, feeling the cool air brush against his face. He had always been the first one awake, eager to get a head start, but today, it felt different. There was no rush, no need to hurry. He was used to pushing himself beyond his limits, to racing ahead of everyone else. But now, for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight of that pressure. He stood and stretched, taking a deep breath, the fresh air filling his lungs. He felt lighter, more centered, as though the shift that had started within him was settling into place. John had spent years training his body, honing his skills, but now, it was his mind that needed the focus. He had learned so much from James, not just about strength, but about patience, about how to wait for the right moment, how to move forward with purpose, not haste. The camp was starting to stir as the other soldiers began to wake, but John was content to stay in the quiet for a little longer. He knew today would be different, just like every other day since he had met James. He had learned to embrace the calm. James had been right all along. Strength wasn't just about what you could do in a moment of urgency. It was about how you carried yourself through all the moments in between. How you faced the world without the need to shout, without the need to prove anything to anyone. John had always sought validation, had always been driven by the need to be the best. But now, he realized that true peace came from within, from knowing your worth, from knowing you didn't have to prove it. As the day went on, John found himself more engaged with his fellow soldiers, listening more, speaking less. He found himself offering help when it was needed, but never pushing his way forward. He learned to read the room, to sense when his presence was needed and when it was best to remain quiet. The change was subtle, but it was real. The more he embraced the stillness, the more he realized that it was the moments of silence that held the most power. It wasn't just about doing, it was about being. The next few days were a blur of routine. The usual drills, the usual tasks. But now, John moved through them with a calmness that was new to him. He felt no need to compete, no need to outshine anyone else. He did what was required of him, no more, no less. And for the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace with that. One evening, as the sun began to set, John found himself walking alongside James once again. The quiet of the evening was comforting, the air cooler than it had been during the day. James didn't speak at first, but John could feel the shift in the air. It was as if the old man knew exactly what was going through his mind without a word being spoken. Finally, James broke the silence, his voice steady as always. "You've come a long way, John," he said. John looked at him, surprised by the words. He hadn't expected to hear that. "You've learned to stop fighting the world," James continued, his eyes locking with John's. "And that's the hardest part. When you stop fighting, you start living." John nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle in. He hadn't realized how much he had been fighting until now. It was never about the battles he fought on the outside, but the ones he fought within himself. And now, he was finally starting to let go. The weight that had pressed on his shoulders for so long was lifting, and for the first time, John felt free. He didn't need to race to the top anymore. He didn't need to prove anything. The journey ahead was no longer about reaching the finish line first. It was about walking with purpose, enjoying each step, and knowing that he was enough just as he was. The days were blending into one another now, but John didn't mind. He wasn't counting the hours, the minutes, or the tasks anymore. The urgency that had once driven him was now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of calm and purpose that he had never felt before. Every morning, he woke up to the sun rising over the base, its warm glow, washing over him. He felt grounded, in tune with the world around him. It was strange at first, to not feel the need to rush, to not feel the constant pressure to perform, to be the best. But as time passed, he realized how freeing it was. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. Instead, he was simply moving forward at his own pace, taking each day as it came. James's presence had a profound effect on him. The old man had taught him so much, not just about military strategy or survival, but about life. It wasn't always about achieving the next great thing. Sometimes, it was about living in the moment and appreciating what you had right in front of you. One afternoon, as John walked through the base, he found himself thinking about his past decisions. He had spent so many years focused on climbing the ranks, on proving himself to others, on earning the approval of his superiors. But now, none of that seemed important. He wasn't looking for approval anymore. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. All he wanted was to be the best version of himself, for his own peace of mind. As he walked past the barracks, he saw a group of younger soldiers, their laughter filling the air. They seemed so carefree, so different from the way he had been. He had always been so serious, so focused on the task at hand. But now, he saw the value in enjoying the little moments, in laughing with others, in not taking life too seriously. John smiled to himself and walked on, feeling a lightness he hadn't felt in years. That evening, after dinner, he found himself sitting outside again, looking at the stars. The night was calm, the sky clear. It felt good to sit in silence, to just be. He thought about James, about the lessons he had learned from him. James had always been there, steady and unshaken. He had never sought the spotlight, never looked for recognition. And yet, he had earned more respect than anyone John had ever met. James didn't need to announce his worth. He didn't need to boast about his achievements. His quiet strength spoke for itself. John knew now that it wasn't about what others thought of him. It was about how he saw himself, how he carried himself through life. He had always been defined by his actions, by what he could achieve. But now, he knew that the real measure of a man wasn't in his accomplishments, but in the way he treated others, in the way he carried himself with humility and grace. As John looked up at the stars, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. For the first time, he was content with where he was in life. He didn't need to be anyone else. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He was enough, just as he was. As the weeks went on, John began to notice the changes in the way he approached the world around him. He no longer felt the need to rush through his days, ticking off items on a checklist. Instead, he took his time, focusing on the present moment, on what was right in front of him. His relationships with the people around him had shifted too. He was no longer the man who walked into a room to assert his dominance or prove his worth. He was a man who listened more than he spoke, who sought to understand rather than to be understood. One afternoon, as John walked past the training area, he saw a group of younger soldiers struggling with one of the drills. The same drill he had once rushed through without a second thought. Normally, he would have passed by, not giving it much attention, but today was different. He stopped and watched for a moment, seeing the frustration on their faces. Without a word, he walked over, crouched down next to one of them, and offered a simple piece of advice. It wasn't forceful or commanding, just a quiet suggestion, a nudge in the right direction. To his surprise, the soldier looked up at him, eyes wide with gratitude. "Thanks, sir," the soldier said, his voice filled with relief. John gave him a small smile, not needing any recognition. It was enough to know he had helped. As he walked away, he realized that he had done something that, only a few months ago, would have seemed foreign to him. He had given without expecting anything in return. He had stepped in to help, not because it was his responsibility, but because it was the right thing to do. And that was enough. The weight of his past had lifted, not because he had accomplished more, but because he had let go of the need to prove himself. In the days that followed, John found himself doing more of the same. He spent less time obsessing over his next promotion or his next mission. Instead, he took pride in the small moments, in the connections he made with his fellow soldiers, in the way he could offer support without making it about himself. One evening, after a long day of training, he found himself sitting on the porch of the barracks, watching the sun dip below the horizon. It was a quiet moment, one of many that had become familiar to him in recent weeks. As he sat there, he couldn't help but think about James and the lessons he had learned. James had been right about everything. It wasn't about speed or strength. It wasn't about achieving the most or being the loudest in the room. It was about having the patience to wait for the right moment, about knowing when to step forward and when to hold back. James had shown him that true strength came from within, from a place of quiet confidence and unwavering resolve. John looked up at the sky, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead. He felt, for the first time in a long time, that he was in exactly the right place. He wasn't chasing anything anymore. He wasn't trying to outrun the past or race toward the future. He was just here, in the present, with everything he needed right in front of him. And that, he realized, was enough. John stood at the edge of the base, his eyes fixed on the horizon as the last light of the day faded away. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, a peaceful reminder of the beauty in the world that he had once overlooked. The stillness around him felt right, felt like home. For the first time in years, he wasn't rushing to meet some goal or deadline. He wasn't thinking about his next promotion or the next challenge to conquer. He was simply existing, grounded in the present, taking in the world around him. The lessons he had learned over the past few months, lessons about strength, humility, and patience, had transformed him. He no longer felt the need to fight against the flow of life. Instead, he learned to go with it, to flow alongside it, knowing that he was enough just as he was. The sound of footsteps approaching broke his reverie. He turned to see James Thompson walking toward him, his familiar calm presence almost as if it was a part of the landscape itself. James stopped a few feet away, glancing at the sunset before looking back at John. "You've been quiet lately," James said, his voice steady, as always. John nodded, not needing to say much. The quiet had become his sanctuary. "It's different now," John replied, his voice soft, but confident. "I'm learning to stop chasing, to just be. It's like the world is moving around me, and I don't have to force myself into it anymore." James studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod of approval. "That's the way it should be," he said. "You've found your rhythm, John. That's something a lot of people never figure out." John didn't need any more words. The truth in James's simple statement rang deep within him. He had spent so much of his life trying to prove himself, trying to show that he was worthy, that he was enough. But now, he understood that worth didn't come from recognition or success. It came from within, from knowing who you were and standing in that truth without fear. He had walked a long road to get here, but now that he was standing in it, the peace he had been searching for was right there with him. "You taught me that," John said, turning to face James fully. "Taught me to stop looking for something I already have. I don't have to be anyone else." James gave him a knowing look, his eyes softening with a quiet pride. "You've always had it in you, John," he said. "You just needed to see it." They stood there together, watching the sky darken, the first stars beginning to appear in the night sky. It felt like the world had paused for just a moment, like everything was aligned in a way it never had been before. John wasn't sure where this path would take him, but for the first time, he didn't need to know. He had come to realize that life wasn't a race. It was a journey, one that didn't need to be rushed. And in this moment, standing beside James, he was exactly where he needed to be. As the days turned into weeks, John found himself adapting to a new rhythm of life, one that didn't rely on constant motion or external validation. The lessons he had learned from James Thompson had embedded themselves deeply within him, shaping the way he interacted with the world. The old man's words, simple yet powerful, had opened his eyes to the beauty of patience, the power of silence, and the strength found in stillness. John no longer rushed through each task, eager to prove something to himself or others. Instead, he approached each day with a quiet determination, knowing that the work would get done when it was meant to, and that his worth wasn't measured by how quickly he completed it. One afternoon, John found himself walking with James once again, the two of them heading toward the edge of the camp where the trees met the open field. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden hue across the landscape. It was a peaceful scene, the kind of moment John had once taken for granted. Now, he soaked it in, grateful for the stillness that surrounded him. "I've been thinking a lot lately," John said, breaking the silence between them, "about how I used to think I needed to keep proving myself, to keep pushing for more. But now, it feels like I was missing the point all along." James turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting John's with a knowing look. "The point is never in the rush, John," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "The point is in the journey itself. The lessons you learn along the way, the people you meet, the quiet moments of growth. That's what matters, not the finish line." John nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of James's words. He had been so focused on the next goal, the next achievement, that he had overlooked the value of the present moment. Now he saw that it was in the little things, the conversations, the connections, the time spent just being, that true fulfillment lay. As they continued walking, John felt a sense of peace he had never known before. The weight of his past struggles, the pressure he had placed on himself, seemed to fade into the distance. He didn't need to be anyone else. He didn't need to prove anything. He had everything he needed within himself. "Thank you, John," said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. "For everything. I don't think I would have figured it out without you." James gave him a small, genuine smile, a smile that conveyed more than words ever could. "You figured it out yourself, John," he said. "I just helped you see it." They walked on in silence, the sun now dipping below the horizon, leaving a trail of soft colors behind. John didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready to face it with the same quiet strength that had been instilled in him. He had learned that it wasn't about rushing ahead, about achieving more, or about being the best. It was about being true to himself, about taking each day as it came, and about appreciating the journey. And with that realization, John finally felt free.